Thank you. Welcome to Objects of Obsession, coming live from the New Art Gallery in Walsall. Today I'm joined by an artist with two names, Bob and Roberta Smith, whose career has moved from everything from sign painting and painting to installation to political activism, and who founded the Art Party in the 2015 general election. But he's also, he might not see it this way, but I do, a revered member of the art establishment. He was a trustee of the Tate Gallery, he's been elected a Royal Academician, and he's OBE. In 2010, he began a residency here at the New Art Gallery in Walsall, which began a relationship with this sculpture. And Bob, this is your object of obsession. It's Epstein, Jacob Epstein's portrait of his daughter, Esther, from 1944. Why?
Well, I think it is just an absolutely beautiful sculpture. It summons up a few things going on with Epstein. When I was a kid, I used to go to, I come from an arty family. My dad used to run Chelsea School of Art, and so we used to go to the Tate when I was a kid, and we would see Epstein's more radical art, his vorticist art, the rock drill. But then we'd also see these bronze sculptures of people like Tagore and various different luminaries who were around in the 1950s. And I, as a child, I used to think, what is the connection between these two things? It seems to be the work of two different artists. And when I was invited to come and do the residency here, I saw this sculpture and I suddenly got it. I suddenly thought that this somehow is a really important work because it's between these two ideas, really. Epstein had a huge collection of ethnographic art and pieces of Egyptian art, and which informed things like the rock drill and all the amazing stone carvings that he made. But this sculpture, this bronze head, which is made from life, is talking about that relationship. She is she's a bit like Nefertiti in a way. She has this, kind of hairdo. She's staring straight ahead. She has these amazing almond eyes. And so there was that relationship. And I just thought that is an amazing thing. Just of itself, it is an amazing thing. And some of his sculpture, if I'm absolutely frank, can seem a bit schmaltzy and a little bit kitsch.
So you mean the portraits that you
the other portraits, yes.
You think they were commercial, essentially? Or was there a dispassionate relationship between him and the sitter?
I think he was doing them, in absolutely good faith. But they're a different kind of thing. He's trying to, the great thing about Epstein is an incredible outsider in British art. He's a Jewish New Yorker, and they have a kind of, storytelling fluidity. They're not modernist kind of sculptures in a way, but this sculpture is modern. Her stare somehow seems to be modern, and it's informed by his interest in ethnographic art, I think. So I agree, actually. I think there's something Egyptian. You said Nefertiti, the kind of priestess, and there's a beautiful small sculpture actually in the cabinet behind that belonged to Epstein that you could see traces of that here. Yes.
But the fact that this is his daughter, gives it an intensity. Are we over projecting? I mean, if we didn't know it was his daughter, would it have that dispassionate quality, or do you think that there's a problematic aspect of this sculpture that somehow draws that out? I don't mean you inevitably know his father and daughter.
When I first came in here, the reason why I'm telling the story about its innate properties really is because I saw it and I thought that is great. It's arresting and powerful in some sort of way. But then part of the project was to look at the whole project really was to look at Epstein's archive. And then I find it difficult to talk about it actually now. You find out the story of Esther. And it's a difficult thing because she, when he made this sculpture, we think, or the gallery thinks, and it's outlined actually, it's not my research that's outlined this, is a woman called Cressida Connolly, but we think that she didn't know that he was her father. And I think it's Epstein's genius actually, that he unwittingly betrays himself somehow. It's this incredibly unequal relationship between the man, the artist, looking at a young woman and saying, I want to make it, so he's making a sculpture because it's his daughter. But she doesn't know that. But in that sculpture, you know that there's something wrong. You know that she is looking straight, she's not looking at him. She's not looking at us, she's looking through us. And I just find that, and this, this dark story which we can talk about.
She was 15 when this was made, and she lived to 25.
Yeah, she lived to 25, but the long and the short of it is that she took her life after seeing her. It's more complicated than this, but in 1954, in November, she took her life. In January 1954, her brother died after having a kind of, I suppose now we'd call it a schizophrenic episode, and he was given some kind of sedative. The Epstein's doctor at that time was an optometrist, and so they provided something to calm him down, and so that he could be taken away in an ambulance. And he had a heart attack and died. And she was there at this dinner. She saw all this happen. There were books in the archive here of that Epstein gave him, and he scored in these books, Epstein, a sexual pervert, and it's and then earlier books where he writes, Epstein has made a dedication to his son saying, this is for Sonny, which implies that, there is an understanding. Yeah. But then Theo has written as a note to himself, mio padre, this is my father. So there's this kind of, I'm certain up to about, 14, 15, they didn't know, he was just a family friend coming to visit. And their sister, Kitty, lived away from the family. So I think there was a sense that, who was this bloke? And turning up, and then the revelation that he was their father. It's unimaginable, actually. It's an unimaginable situation.
It is a deeply tragic situation, and it seems obvious, and the theory is that she took her own life partly because she'd witnessed her brother at the end of his life, but she had a boyfriend, didn't she, who also committed suicide?
Yeah. She had a relationship, and he committed suicide in that year.
So can we?
But I think there was a sense. I think young people, they take on board that sense of implication in things, and I think there's a sense in which. It's possible to say that, people would have, what can you do? When somebody dies in those kinds of circumstances, you think, well, something else should have happened. He shouldn't be dead. Maybe I should have done something. And I think there's that sense of, probably everybody there, not just Esther, probably felt that things shouldn't have happened in quite that way that evening.
Do you think this, though, guilt-ridden as it may be, or the implications of the relationship or the non-relationship notwithstanding, do you think this is a labour of love?
Oh, I think it's an amazing labour of love. Yeah, I think Epstein, Epstein is an extraordinary figure. It's not just about this story. This whole business of going through the archive, the Epstein archive, was also thinking about relationships in British art, and it really changed me actually those 3 years, because I think about him as an outsider coming into Britain in 1910, around that time, and he was Jewish. The British art world, Bloomsbury Group, all that lot, they really attempted to close him down. Well, they invented the war artist scheme so they actually wouldn't have to go and fight.
But he was also censored by the British establishment, wasn't he? He did that wonderful commission, which is on what's now Zimbabwe House, but which was the British Medical Association, the 7 Ages of Man. Not surprisingly, the figures were naked. Yes. And within 2 years, the genitals had been hacked off, and it's there still as a monument to, I suppose, prurience, artistic censorship, and the fact that Epstein was the outsider.
Yeah, and also in the 1920s, he had made Rima, which is in Hyde Park, as a monument to an ornithologist. I can't quite remember who that was, but he made this monumental sculpture that was daubed in swastikas. And there was a campaign by the Daily Mail, actually the Royal Academy. Munnings was involved in this to try and have that removed, and so he was really seen as somebody. I think he was seen as somebody as a threat, because he'd come from France. He'd actually hung out with Picasso, Modigliani, and Gaudi and Brescia. He actually was modernism. Yeah. But actually, they like, everything in Britain, it wasn't prepared to take that on board. How do we take that on board?
So was the discovery of this sculpture, or this sculpture is going to filter into the archive, was this disillusioning for you? It seems now your view about Epstein is not black or white, it's complex, it's nuanced. But Epstein, before this, was heroic to you and became less so as a consequence of this?
Well, what it really makes me think about, which is something, is about reality. We think of, and actually it's part of it has been percolating away with me for a long time. It's part of the my real name, folks, is Bob and Roberta Smith. Is Patrick Breuer. But I came up with the idea of Bob and Roberta Smith when I lived in New York in the early 1990s, because I wanted to think, well, actually, Warhol had died, and there was an amazing Warhol retrospective, and one of the things that I loved were all the photographs of Warhol in the factory, and I was living an absolute dream. I had this studio which was factory-like. It was in New York. It looked over the Twin Towers. There was a band playing, and they used to rehearse in there, and I used to look at those photographs and think, well, this is the mythology of the artist kind of confronted me, and I thought I want to make work, but I don't want to engage in self-promotion in that way. I don't want to promote myself, but I want to be an artist. The whole thing about being an artist is based on the individual and the way you look at the world. So obviously the audience want to know about you a little bit. So I wanted to create an artist. So I decided to, and I was really interested in Len Deighton's film, The Ipcress File. When Len Deighton wrote those novels, there was no Harry Palmer. So halfway through the film, they had to come up with Harry Palmer. They had to come up with a name for the spy. So they thought they'd have a counterpoint to James Bond. So they'd have an every person called Harry Palmer. And I thought Bob Smith, that would be a great name for an everyman artist. And so it made me, thinking about Epstein, the great thing about it is to try and uncover the reality. I mean, I love Anthony Gorman and Richard Court, but I think around the time that this project was developing, I heard an interview which was Anthony, completely romanticizing about how Epstein got in touch with a figure and shows us what humanity is. And they were both rhapsodizing about this, and I thought, well, that's okay, but that's not reality. And actually, if you understand the reality of Epstein, his relationships with women and his children, it's much more interesting for a start. And actually, you can see him for what he is. And actually, that is an admirable person, but it's also complex.
But artists...
And his work is complex, and he deserves actually
to be acknowledged,
to think about him not in a myth-making way.
But myths grow up around artists, and even the best of artists, or the most self-aware, fall victim to a certain extent to their own mythology. So calling yourself Bob and Roberta Smith, or inventing an artist persona, maybe that's the wrong way of putting it, yes. Inventing an artist, but can't you just hide behind the myths you create? And in fact, you have it every which way, because you can over-mythologize yourself, but it's still Bob and Roberta Smith, not Patrick.
Yes, but in a weird way, by coming up with Bob, it was a way of sort of saying that, say, well, Bob is a fiction, and actually it's all a bit of a fiction. And so you can confront that, you're confronting that almost as an artwork.
But much of Picasso is a fiction, isn't it?
Yes, it is. Well, I don't know.
I mean, the mythology that grows up around someone like Picasso becomes the sort of extension of fiction, and people project and overread, and that different people, different eras, different cultures read into those kind of artists, the artists they want. Or you might argue that each era gets their own, gets the great art that they want or deserve.
Well, you can't. I mean, the truth is, you can't get to the reality in the way that I'm perhaps positing, because only I know what I know about Bob and Epstein. You know, you've got to root around in archives and do a lot of work to get at the reality of things, to try and understand things. But I think it makes it rich and more complex, rather than just to take on board the myth. We have to inspect things. We have to. I mean, it's part of the problem with the world, is that we don't get to the truth. You know, we live in this age of simulacra and fake news and all of that. And actually, what we need to do as humanity is get to the truth again. I mean, maybe that's too great a thing to say in this relationship with me and Epstein and this amazing sculpture.
Well,
but I think
there's a high bar you've set yourself.
Yeah, I want to get to the truth. You know.
Well, in the work that you made as a consequence of the residency, which there's an installation here, it is interesting that you work with the remnants from the archive. I mean, there's a pair of portraits of Esther and her brother Theo, and there's archive material as well as your painting and constructions and films around it. So you're working with tangible reality. But history becomes a kind of found object for you, doesn't it, in that instance?
It does. It does, and it's also tied in with the idea of the museum, because I think that history, you know, we can think about Epstein, and we can think about, you know, Epstein, it's Kathleen Garman who has the relationship with this part of the country, and that's why the museum is here.
But Esther grew up, her nanny, she grew up for a time in Walsall, which roots her to this place where we are.
Yes, yeah, it does. But I think one of the things about, when I saw this sculpture, I thought, you know, this is an amazing thing. I thought people ought to come to the, I mean, it's interesting to think about this, to think about why people would come to museums. I mean, my idea was quite bald. You know, you go to the Uffizi to see Primavera. You know, that's the thing that drags you in. If you haven't been to Florence, if you went to the Uffizi and you missed Primavera, you've got to go back. And I was thinking, you know, it's the same with the Mona Lisa in the Louvre, same with the Rothko room in the Tate. And I think this, you know, I just think this is, it's such an iconic story. It's so powerful. I mean, she's a Me Too image. You know, she's an image of this discrepancy that we're now realising, you know, I mean, female people have been thinking about this for a long time.
But you mean
but it's now, she's part of, she's a kind of image of that sort of thing. And I think, and actually people need to tell, you know, we need to be told sometimes why things are significant. Another project that I did around this time was to do with Henry Moore's seated figure in Yorkshire Sculpture Park, and the blooming Tower Hamlets Council, who notionally owned that sculpture, wanted to sell it to fill a small hole in their enormous black hole of their budget. And I, with the Art Fund and various other people, we ran a campaign to tell people that that was actually Henry Moore's Guernica. You know, Henry Moore, we all know Henry Moore loved Picasso. He had seen Guernica. He was making these kind of woolly drawings of people sheltering from the bombs in the Second World War. It was, you know, it was Stuka bombers who were destroying Guernica. It was Heinkel bombers that were destroying people in London. He was in East London. He was drawing these women. That sculpture was initially a project for a UNESCO project, which was going to be the headquarters of UNESCO in Paris, and he made that sculpture. For him, that was an iconic image of peace. Yeah. And but the council didn't know that. Well, probably a few curators in the Tate knew that. But people need to shout these things and say, "Look, this is really, really important, and it can have a fantastic resonance."
Well, I like I mean. Two things. First of all, I mean, I live in that part of London. What the great thing was about the Henry Moore was that it was a gift to London County Council, not to Tower Hamlets. So in the end, it wasn't theirs to sell. So it's now been cited elsewhere, which is great.
Yeah.
But I was always taught to beware the cult of masterpieces. Now, that was what's called the new art history, and I think you can re-examine that. And I think a lot of art, people's way into art is by certain works that have greater resonance than others. But you speak about it with such passion. But I've not seen your careers. I don't mean you haven't made a masterpiece. I mean the way you, respectfully. But I mean the way you work doesn't seem geared around the construction of individual masterpieces. You work in a fluid way. You make work in all sorts of different ways, media. You work with other people. There's a kind of generosity or an openness to different approaches. In the back of your mind, is the masterpiece still the great aspiration? Do you still see that idea in your mind?
You need to come to Ramsgate, Tim.
Yeah,
this weekend, what are you doing this weekend?
Yeah, I'll be down there. No, there's a 4-panel piece downstairs. It's very powerful. It's a great work. Yeah. But
it refers to something else.
Yeah.
No, but one of the things that I think, one of the things that this project actually, and also a little bit with the Henry Moore thing, one of the things that I think that's quite powerful to do is to try and make people laugh or cry. I know, and
well, you've done both in this interview. I mean, you were pretty choked when you were thinking about that story.
I do get very emotional about it. But I think it's to do with this. I think it's to do with storytelling on some level. So a lot of my work is about writing. It's about writing stories. It's about making them into documents and objects. It's born out of a kind of history of art which isn't hugely emotional. You know, the kinds of people which are the generation of people before me doing that, making that kind of work, are highly conceptual people, interested in, you know, syntax and linguistics and text. But my mission is to take that idea of, you know, writing and making it into work and thinking about that in order to try and stick back into art the idea that art, you know, in a way, modernist art, one of the things that it creates is axioms and abstractions and removes you from the world. And one of the things that I sort of think that I want to try and do is to try and bring back emotion into that in some sort of way. So a couple of years ago, you know, at the Royal Academy, I did this transcription of this amazing interview between the broadcaster Eddie Mair and the surgeon David Knott, which took me about 5 months to paint. I mean, that interview, if you read that interview or listen to David Knott... It's
about the Syrian War, isn't it?
It's about the Syrian War, and he's an amazing surgeon who goes, you know, every single break that he's ever had from his job in London is to go and work for Médecins Sans Frontières. And but this interview is it's a powerful thing. And at one stage, Eddie Mair gets so choked in the middle of the interview that there's a kind of gap in the middle of the interview. So I've transcribed all of that because I thought I didn't want that to disappear. And that's, you'd be a really cold person to read that and not understand that that is about somebody trying to say there's something about art and our humanity, and trying to tap into something there, which is about empathy, I suppose. Empathy with David, not empathy with all these people being killed.
Were these values that your parents instilled into you? You said your father was an artist. Your mother was also an artist, and we don't want to give too much away, but you are doing a project for the Royal Academy shortly that involves both its rather bad record on gender and female artists, but also your mother's art. But did your parents instill in you the idea that art was powerful and moving, or is that something that you came to yourself?
It's partly, it's definitely to do with my parents, but it's not to do with anything particularly that they told me. For them, art was really quite it was more fluid for my mum, but for my dad, it was really bloody hard work. You know, you've got to get up a hillside with your paints and sit there for hours in the cold and try and measure those colours in the distant horizon. You know, it's really hard work. But the thing that really is the overview of it, because my parents were, you know, extremely working class people, and because of the Second World War, they had opportunities afforded them. Which means that I'm here talking to you, basically. I mean, you know, that their lives were revolutionised essentially by going to art school, and that's part of the reason why I'm so keen on trying to advocate for art education, because I worry that the strange opportunities that occurred for my parents because of World War II, and after World War II, new people came into the arts and changed it. It brought a new kind of dynamism, and I think my parents were sort of, the teachers of some of those kinds of people, if you like, if not perhaps them themselves. But it was powerful and transformative. Art and art education is a powerful and transformative thing for individuals, and I just think. I suppose, I need to do some therapy or something, but I do find it's quite close to the bone. I get, it's all about justice, and, I get to the kind of reverie where I think, art is all about your human rights. It's all about kids and their voices and that's why this is so powerful, because in a way we're seeing her voice. It's his genius is showing us his voice, but his unwitting stupidity is that she's looking straight through him and doesn't care much about him. So it's that kind of collision, which is so powerful, I think.
Indeed, but that power, the power that art has to instill that response, that emotion, that reaction, you've made a very eloquent and impassioned plea that art should be able to play a role in changing things, having broader implications. I saluted your art party in the last election, but British politics has become so polarised and art seems so marginalised. It was almost, if not a gesture, certainly a necessary gesture, but do you actually believe still that art can play a significant role politically in Britain, or do we have to actually get round the political system now, and that the arts almost needs to find a way of circumventing it rather than trying to engage the support of politicians for whom arts are just not a vote winner?
I think the whole of a lot of my arts advocacy is really inspired by Peter Hall. So when I was a kid, probably when you were a kid, on TV, Peter Hall, the head of the National Theatre, his response to Margaret Thatcher and a round of cuts to the arts then was to go on national television and say, what you're doing is wrong. And to argue for some sort of subsidy of the arts. And I suppose it's a blunt and quite old-fashioned sort of thing. But when I was the trustee of the Tate, definitely the response was, initially, Nick Sirota, when there was a cuts to the arts first came in, he wrote a letter, which was a brilliant letter, where he said, this is the biggest attack on culture since the Luftwaffe in 1940 or something like that. And I thought, wow, great. But actually, that was the end. He got criticised for that. And then the response really from the people who run arts institutions would be saying, well, look, we've got to work with these people. We've got to accept the situation, and we've got to work with politicians. And I think there's some truth in that. But if there aren't a few people saying, look, what you're doing is wrong, you haven't got much of an argument. And so I saw my role in that point to say, look, as an artist, I just think. I think we were spending 7 pence in every £100 on the arts in 2010. It's gone down to about threepence now, and that's a mistake. You could double that money. It wouldn't make absolutely no difference to austerity budgets and all that sort of thing. So I think people, and also I think it's that thing of lost stories. It's the same business with all these bronze modernist sculptures sitting on estates and in shopping precincts up and down the country. People have lost that sense. It's partly because of time. The Second World War is receding. We're beginning to, we're not in this kind of post-war era now. We're in a different. We're going to be in a. My children. Well, exactly. My children are always going to think of a before and after Brexit, if not when, if that goes ahead. So that relationship, we are in a different place, but it is about storytelling. It's about telling those stories and saying to people, with some sort of passion that all this stuff has been made for a reason. This is not just a bronze sculpture of a young woman. It is a really significant sort of thing, and it's about that storytelling idea. I think that's really important.
I'm delighted you became a Royal Academician and that you were a trustee of the Tate. Some artists are more conflicted about their engagement with the establishment. So I teased you at the beginning by saying whether or not you would see yourself in those terms. Is that notion of the artist as outsider not something that plays out in your mind much? That you are who you are, and your engagement with whoever you can engage with is what matters to you, not your relationship to the establishment. So the old idea of the avant-garde doesn't interest you.
I think I am. I still actually think of myself as an outsider, although. I've been subsumed with various different acronyms or whatever it's after my name. But I still think myself, I think all artists see themselves as outsiders, because you have to, on some sense, be on the outside to see things. You have to have some sort of distance. And so ideas about, I do think about, avant-gardists kinds of notions. I don't see myself as an avant-gardist particularly, but I see myself as somebody who looks in on society, I think necessarily in on politicians, and tries to make work which is, genuinely critical. So in that sense, I think it's important to be on the outside of things. Obviously there's a collision in that idea, the idea that I'm a Royal Academician, but I suspect a lot of the Royal Academicians are such crazy, oddball, maverick, lunatic individuals that many of them would probably see themselves as outsiders as well. And I think some of them definitely insiders, but a lot of them are probably outsiders as well.
That's true. I think it's an artist-run organisation, so although we're not here to defend the Royal Academy, it has that kind of maverick quality as well as that sense of the establishment, and there's a lot of creative tension there. Anyway, let's throw Bob and Roberta Smith, R.A.O.B.E., out to the floor. Are there questions anyone would like to ask from the floor? There'll be some questions coming in on Twitter and Facebook. Yeah.
Your work is concerned around bringing context to objects, and I'm working with archives to do that, it seems. And then there's obviously digital and online and social media that has a power of pulling those two things together. What is it around the online space and your work that you find interesting, and what is the opportunity you see there?
Yeah, I do use Instagram and Twitter, and I try and tell people about things. I think it starts off on the basis of trying to get people to turn up for things, and also
you've done pretty well tonight.
But the most amazing thing about Twitter when I first discovered it was around this Henry Moore campaign. So I said we were going to do a flash mob, and I'm going to go and buy my verdigris green tights now, and I'm going to see if I can find a green dress so we can do a flash mob, and we'll all be outside the council dressed as Old Flo. And I rigged it a little bit, so I got some of my students from London Metropolitan University, the CAS, where I teach, which happens to be in Tower Hamlets. And so we all turned up at the station, but because I'd done this Twitter campaign with a hashtag Save Old Flo, what was really powerful about it was that there were 20 people at the station dressed as Old Flo. And some of the costumes that they made were absolutely amazing. The two ladies had made these fantastic outfits out of canvas and then verdigrised them all up. And we all went and sat on the steps outside the council, and the Guardian came and photographed it. We made a film and put it on YouTube. And I suddenly realised in that moment, actually, that the development of a story on social media is such an impactful and useful sort of thing, and also and you can engage people in an ongoing heuristic developmental narrative, and they can see online where something's going, and there's a bit of jeopardy in that as well. You sort of think, God, that could all go wrong. Is he mad? Why is he doing that? And I think that aspect to it is really rich and interesting.
Yeah, no, it is, but also I love the fact that they respond physically to the physical sculpture by dressing up as the sculpture, and it kind of reiterates the point. This isn't an attack on digital media or art on using digital media.
Yeah.
But there's you were talking earlier about the power of this particular sculpture in the physical presence, that it's lost when it's filmed to a certain extent or photographed. And that seems to, that kind of visceral need that human beings have to congregate and physically engage seems interesting.
Well, yeah, it's making it manifest. You've got to, art, that's the tricky thing about art, is anybody, actually, all of these ideas, all the mythology of artists and all of that, it's not that amazing. But it's that the artist does it. You've got to be able to do that, and you can have the idea to do it, but you've got to do it. And I think that's the thing. It's making it manifest, making that into an object, a film, a print, a drawing, a painting. I think that's where the magic happens.
Yeah. Yeah.
Epstein is one of my idols, if not the idol for me. And I just wondered, because you are interested in art history and you like delving in the archives, thinking about what else was going on while Epstein was a fairly young man, say between 1910 and 1940, 30, 40, and thinking about some of the other movements, but also relating to what you were saying about how Epstein's creations move you and the emotions that are living there in these sculptures. And so I thought of two, and don't ask me why I thought of these two particular people or groups. I was thinking of Eric Gill, who sculpted, who did letters, very cool, and yet had a peculiar relationship with his daughters.
And those different four-legged friends as well.
Yeah.
Character.
And then I thought of the Bloomsbury set, because you didn't know, what was it, something about circles, triangles living in squares? I've slightly misquoted that. But
Roger Fry.
yes.
Well, Gill and Epstein were seen
Gill and Epstein
in parallel, and it's a very acute point, because Gill, in some ways, the monster you hinted that Epstein may have been as a father on occasion seems more manifested.
Well, I don't think monsterism. I don't think had anything to do with Gill, really. I mean, Gill was really quite a pernicious character, wasn't he?
Yeah.
I mean, I think you have to come back to this idea of trying to understand the truth of it, and not to get lost in the myth of it.
But there is, what's interesting about Gill and Epstein, and that was an aspect that was picked up by Moore and Hepworth and others, and it may have been what Anthony Gormley was talking about, that you referred to earlier, was this idea about truth to materials. That there's something about, I mean, which obviously this is working in clay.
Yeah.
But the idea of the power of the material revealed, and in Epstein's carving, I mean, there's amazing things in alabaster as well as in stone, and in Gill's work, and then in Moore and Hepworth. This became a very powerful idea in British art, in British sculpture.
Yeah, but you see, the thing that Epstein had is that Epstein had something to say, and I think that's the thing that the Bloomsbury group, certainly not Virginia Woolf. Virginia Woolf definitely had something to say, but I think it's that sort of, I think there's a sense in which British art is always made by the Bloomsbury group. The Bloomsbury group is a continuum in British art. Every now and again.
You mean that aristocratic good taste?
The aristocratic good taste and these kind of upper class individuals who are great at visual art and design, but perhaps we're not so interested in their stories, because there aren't stories which are particularly about transformation in their work. But somebody comes along like Epstein and he smashes that up. And the Second World War had that effect, because suddenly a load of working class people were involved in the arts, and suddenly you got an explosion of design, and you got kind of pop art and an interest in vernacular art. And it happened again with the YBAs, actually. The YBAs, I mean, if you talk to Michael Craig Martin, he said we had to do it with the YBAs and Damien and Tracy and all that lot, because nobody was going to accept them at the Royal College of Art. They were never going to get into the Royal Academy, because they weren't from the right stock. And so I think there were these moments in British art, and Epstein really represents that, where he comes in and he blasts it apart. And then you can have Henry Moore emerging, you know, who was kind of his sort of pupil at one stage.
So in a way this work blew a few things apart for you.
Oh, I think this project in Warsaw was enormously important for me because it gave me the confidence to think. Actually, it gave me the confidence because before this, I was very enamoured with the idea of linguistics and language. I've been fascinated with text for absolutely ever since I was a kid, reading the back of Peter Blake's Sgt. Pepper's album. I wasn't so interested in the front. I liked the lyrics on the back, and so pop lyrics and how a text is about the space in between the text as much as it is about what the writer is trying to say. So that kind of visuality, but it was semantic, and actually now after this project, and I suppose also getting a bit older and having children myself, I'm thinking about my own relationship as an artist with my own kids and my need to get into the studio and all that sort of thing. It made me think, actually, time's running out. Let's get serious.
Get on with it. And that's one of the things you do within the installation that you make here, is that you deal with legacy. You ask the question, which is comic and tragic: what happens to you when you die? What happens to your reputation as an artist?
Yeah. Well, your brushes get given to art students,
and your clothes get given to Oxfam. You say.
Exactly. Yeah. And your prices crash.
Sometimes they do, sometimes they don't. Right, there's a Jenny Gibson's given us a question on Facebook. She said, does the backstory behind the object matter, or should it just be about the object?
Well, I think it's definitely both. I mean, I think that's my message to everybody tonight. Don't get caught up in that dualism, Jenny.
Yes.
So it's not helpful. It's both.
Yeah.
It's really, this is, and it is about the physical presence. It is about the manifestation.
Art for its own sake is only half the story.
It is only half the story. It's definitely, it's all about the story, and it's all about the object.
Okay, and then there's another question from Hannah Searle. Is there an Epstein figure today?
What, a lunatic maverick coming in from outside?
How about the embodied spirit? No. But do you see anyone who has that potentially that kind of impact, or who's had that kind of impact?
Well, I think as I say, I think the last time we've had that, and we're in a bit of I think in a sense we're in a bit of a pool with art at the moment for various different social reasons. I think dynamic things are happening, but I think I do think people like Damien and Gary and Tracy and in a way probably Sarah Lucas is the inheritor of Epstein. In the gallery here, I list a whole load of artists going from Rodin influenced Epstein influenced all these artists that I really like, called like George Fullard and Peter Starpitt, mid British modernists from the 60s and 70s, and then I go on to more conceptual sculptors, and I've got Philida Barlow. Anybody dealing with weight, tension, surface, but also something to say. And I think actually it does reside. If you think about Sarah Lucas, she's trying to tell you something, and that's powerful. So maybe that's an odd thing to say, but maybe Sarah Lucas is the Epstein.
Good answer. Yeah, interesting. Final questions before we finish? I just want to ask you one question. You've been very open about the impact that this particular work has had on you, and how it fed a certain body of work, but also how it opened up your the way you think and the way you approach art. You're now a successful artist with a strong reputation in certain areas. Does that success give you now the liberty? Do you feel liberated to do what you feel compelled to do, what you want to do? Or is there something straitjacketing about success that means that Bob and Roberta Smith has to behave or make art in a certain way? Because you hinted at that with Epstein, to say that he reaches a certain level of achievement, he's got to make a living, but also you didn't use the phrase knocking them out, but the portraits were, portrait busts were something that I suppose in later life he just kept on making. Do you worry about that?
Well, I think you know, I think with Epstein, he was definitely, because he was trying to keep all these families going. Well, that's the reason why he was doing that. I mean, I think he really wanted to be on the edge of the buildings doing those amazing stone carvings. But he was making these busts of the famous because he had to keep that family going. I don't really feel like that. I mean, my tip, if you're not, is to keep your overheads low. And,
keep your moral compass straight.
Well, I think, you know, I'm completely untroubled by that, because actually I do exactly what I want. And it's partly because, you know, I am, you know, to be absolutely frank, you know, I'm not an enormously auctionable artist making trophy items for the luxury goods market, which is the oligarch art world. I'm somebody making art because I want to do it. But the way I do it is, I paint all these things myself, and I generally make them all myself. So it's kind of, you know, I see myself a bit like musicians in the 1970s. You know, people know who they are, but they're not necessarily making that much money. And so that's where I am. I'm a bit of I'm an old punk, really.
On which note we should end. You can see this again. You can go to the website, #Objects of Obsession. You can also follow the series on the Royal Academy's website, the Museum of the Mind in Bethlehem, and also the Manchester Art Gallery. But can I thank the New Art Gallery in Walsall for hosting this? You can also go to their website. But above all, can I thank Bob and Roberta Smith for a great conversation. Thank you, Bob.
Thank you, Esther.
Thank you, Esther, yeah.